Alrighty, sorry about the delay. Had some technical issues getting started and then got sidetracked. Okay, so welcome back to Free Read, Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fraggeth, and today we're going to be doing more Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, the first in the Southern Reach or Area X trilogy. It has been a long week, so forgive me if I don't actually remember what happened previously. Yes, the biologist is setting off on her own after a difference of opinion as to how to proceed with the surveyor now that the psychologist has abandoned them, apparently. So the biologist is setting forth. She is. What do we got? Here's a list of her equipment. Oh, right. She even tries using a hypnotic suggestion that she gleaned from the psychologist on the surveyor, which does not work. And the surveyor is like, "You'd do anything, wouldn't you, to get your way?" The surveyor said, but the fact was, she held the rifle. What weapon did I really have? And I told myself it was because I didn't want the anthropologist's death to be meaningless that I had suggested this course of action. When I did not reply, she sighed, then said, with weariness in her voice, I finally figured it out while I was developing those useless photographs. What bothered me the most is not the thing in the tunnel or the way you conduct yourself or anything the psychologist did. It's this rifle I'm holding. This damn rifle. I stripped it down to clean it and I found it was made of 30-year-old parts cobbled together. Nothing we brought with us is from the present. Not our clothes, not our shoes. It's all old junk. Restored crap. We've been living in the past this whole time, in some sort of reenactment. And why? She made a derisive sound. You don't even know why. It was as much as she'd ever said to me at one time. I wanted to say that this information registered as little more than the mildest of surprises in the hierarchy of what we had thus far discovered. But I didn't. All I had left was to be succinct. "Will you remain here until I return?" I asked. This was now the essential question, and I didn't like the speed of her reply, or its tone. "Whatever you want." "Don't say anything you can't back up," I said. I had long ago stopped believing in promises. Biological imperatives, yes. Environmental factors, yes. Promises, no. "Fuck off," she said. So that's how we left it. Her leaning back in that rickety chair, holding her assault rifle, as I went off to discover the source of the light I had seen the night before. I had with me a knapsack full of food and water, along with two of the guns, equipment to take samples, and one of the microscopes. Somehow I felt safer taking a microscope with me. Some part of me, too, no matter how I had tried to convince the surveyor to come with me, welcomed the chance to explore alone, to not be dependent on, or worried about, anyone else. I looked back a couple of times before the trail twisted away, and the surveyor was still sitting there, staring at me like a distorted reflection of who I'd been just days before. And that takes us now to part trois. Troisième. No, troisième is something else. Part 3. Immolation. As in, I fell into a burning ring of fire. Let's get to see how long this part is. It's not super long. There are, what, 5 parts? How long is the next one? I'm only going to be able to do the one because I'm like completely tapped from the week prior. Let me get this bookmark in here so I know where I am at. Part 4, I think, is longish, but we won't worry about that. Actually, Part 4 is... it's a little longer than Part 3. But we're not going to be able to read both today, but that's fine. And then there's the 5th part, Dissolution, and that'll be the week after next, provided no scheduling conflicts arise, and I have to flip. And that's about the same length as Part 4, maybe a page longer, if that. So yeah, 3 solid weeks, including this week, of doing this. And then we'll move on to Maelstrom by Peter Watts, the second in the Rifters trilogy. Kind of quadrilogy, but you'll see. Okay, give me a sec here. I'm gonna get some water in me, and then we'll get cracking. Zero 03. Immolation. Now a strange mood took hold of me as I walked silent and alone through the last of the pines and the cypress knees that seemed to float in the black water, the gray moss that coated everything. It was as if I traveled through the landscape with the sound of an expressive and intense aria playing in my ears. Everything was imbued with emotion, awash in it, and I was no longer a biologist, but somehow the crest of a wave building and building, but never crashing to shore. I saw with such new eyes the subtleties of the transition to the marsh, the salt flats. As the trail became a raised berm, dull, algae-choked lakes spread out to the right, and a canal flanked it to the left. Rough channels of water meandered out in a maze through a forest of reeds on the canal side, and islands, oases of wind-contorted trees, appeared in the distance like sudden revelations. The stooped and blackened appearance of these trees was shocking against the vast and shimmering gold-brown of the reeds. The strange quality of the light upon this habitat, the stillness of it all, the sense of waiting, brought me halfway to a kind of ecstasy. Beyond, the lighthouse stood, and before that, I knew, the remains of a village, also marked on the map. But in front of me was the trail, strewn at times with oddly tortured-looking pieces of heavy white driftwood flung far inland from past hurricanes. Tiny red grasshoppers inhabited the long grass in legions, with only a few frogs present to feast on them, and flattened grass tunnels marked where the huge reptiles had, after bathing in the sun, slid back into the water. Above, raptors searched the ground below for prey, circling as if in geometric patterns, so controlled was their flight. In that cocoon of timelessness, with the lighthouse seeming to remain distant no matter how long I walked, I had more time to think about the tower and our expedition. I felt that I had abdicated my responsibility to that point, which was to consider those elements found inside of the tower as part of a vast biological entity that might or might not be terrestrial. But contemplating the sheer enormity of that idea on a macro level would have broken my mood like an avalanche crashing into my body. So, what did I know? What were the specific details? An organism was writing living words along the interior walls of the tower, and may have been doing so for a very long time. Whole ecosystems had been born and now flourished among the words, dependent on them, before dying off as the words faded. But this was a side effect of creating the right conditions, a viable habitat. It was important only in that the adaptations of the creatures living in the words could tell me something about the tower. For example, the spores I had inhaled, which pointed to a truthful seeing. I was brought up short by this idea, the wind-lashed marsh reeds a wide, blurred ripple all around me. I had assumed the psychologist had hypnotized me into seeing the tower as a physical construction, not a biological entity, and an effect of the spores had made me resistant to this hypnotic suggestion. But what if the process had been more complex? What if, by whatever means, the tower emanated an effect too, one that constituted a kind of defensive mimicry, and the spores had made me immune to that illusion? Telescoping out from this context, I had several questions and few answers. What role did the crawler serve? I had decided it was important to assign a name to the maker of words. What was the purpose of the physical recitation of the words? Did the actual words matter, or would any words do? Where had the words come from? What was the interplay between the words and the tower creature? Put another way, were the words a form of symbiotic or parasitic communication between the crawler and the tower? Either the crawler was an emissary of the tower, or the crawler had originally existed independent from it and come into its orbit later. But without the damned missing sample of the tower wall, I couldn't really begin to guess. Which brought me back to the words. Where lies the strangling fruit that came from the hand of the sinner? Wasps and birds and other nest builders often used some core, irreplaceable substance or material to create their structures, but would also incorporate whatever they could find in their immediate environment. This might explain the seemingly random nature of the words. It was just building material, and perhaps this explained why our superiors had forbidden high-tech being brought into Area X, because they knew it could be used in unknown and powerful ways by whatever occupied this place. Several new ideas detonated inside me as I watched a marsh hawk dive into the reeds and come up with a rabbit struggling in its talons. First, that the words, the line of them, their physicality, were absolutely essential to the well-being of either the tower or the crawler, or both. I had seen the faint skeletons of so many past lines of writing that one might assume some biological imperative for the crawler's work. This process might feed into the reproductive cycle of the tower or the crawler. Perhaps the crawler depended upon it, and it had some subsidiary benefit to the tower. Or vice versa. Perhaps words didn't matter because it was a process of fertilization, only completed when the entire left-hand wall of the tower had a line of words running along its length. Despite my attempt to sustain the aria in my head, I experienced a jarring return to reality as I worked through these possibilities. Suddenly, I was just a person trudging across a natural landscape of a type I had seen before. There were too many variables, not enough data, and I was making some base assumptions that might not be true. For one thing, in all of this, I assumed that neither crawler nor tower was intelligent, in the sense of possessing free will. My procreation theory would still apply in such a widening context, but there were other possibilities. The role of ritual, for example, in certain cultures and societies. How I longed for access to the anthropologist's mind now, even though in studying social insects I had gained some insight into the same areas of scientific endeavor. And if not ritual, I was back to the purposes of communication, this time in a conscious sense, not a biological one. What could the words on the wall communicate to the tower? I had to assume, or thought I did, that the crawler didn't just live in the tower. It went far afield to gather the words, and it had to assimilate them, even if it didn't understand them, before it came back to the tower. The crawler had to, in a sense, memorize them, which was a form of absorption. The strings of sentences on the tower's walls could be evidence brought back by the crawler to be analyzed by the tower. But there is a limit to thinking about even a small piece of something monumental. You still see the shadow of the whole thing rearing up behind you, and you become lost in your thoughts, in part from the panic of realizing the size of that imagined Leviathan. I had to leave it there, compartmentalized, until I could write it all down, and seeing it on the page, begin to divine the true meaning. And now the lighthouse had finally gotten larger on the horizon. This presence weighed on me as I realized that the surveyor had been correct about at least one thing. Anyone within the lighthouse would see me coming for miles. Then, too, that other effect of the spores, the brightness in my chest, continued to sculpt me. As I walked, and by the time it continued to sculpt me as I walked, and by the time I reached the deserted village that told me I was halfway to the lighthouse, I believed I could have run a marathon. I did not trust that feeling. I felt, in so many ways, that I was being lied to. Having seen the preternatural calm of the members of the 11th Expedition, I had often thought during our training of the benign reporting from the first expedition. Area X, before the ill-defined event that locked it behind the border 30 years ago and made it subject to so many inexplicable occurrences, had been part of a wilderness that lay adjacent to a military base. People had still lived there on what amounted to a wildlife refuge, but not many, and they tended to be the tight-lipped descendants of fisher folk. Their disappearance might have seemed to some a simple intensifying of a process begun generations before. When Area X first appeared, there was vagueness and confusion, and it is still true that out in the world not many people know that it exists. The government's version of events emphasized a localized environmental catastrophe stemming from experimental military research. This story leaked into the public sphere over a period of several months, so that, like the proverbial frog in a hot pot, people found the news entering their consciousness gradually as part of the general daily noise of media oversaturation about ongoing ecological devastation. Within a year or two, it had become the province of conspiracy theorists and other fringe elements. By the time I volunteered and was given the security clearance to have a firm picture of the truth, the idea of an Area X lingered in many people's minds like a dark fairy tale, something they did not want to think about too closely. If they thought about it at all. We had so many other problems. During training, we were told that the first expedition went in 2 years after the event, after scientists found a way to breach the border. It was the first expedition that set up the base camp perimeter and provided a rough map of Area X, confirming many of the landmarks. They discovered a pristine wilderness devoid of any human life. They found what some might call a preternatural silence. I felt as if I were both freer than ever before and more constrained, one member of the expedition said. I felt as if I could do anything as long as I did not mind being watched. Others mentioned feelings of euphoria and extremes of sexual desire, for which there was no explanation and which, ultimately, their superiors found unimportant. If one could spot anomalies in their reports, these anomalies lay at the fringes. For one thing, we never saw their journals. Instead, they offered up their accounts in long recorded interviews. This, to me, hinted at some avoidance of their direct experience, although at the time I also thought perhaps I was being paranoid, in a non-clinical sense. Some of them offered descriptions of the abandoned village that seemed inconsistent to me. The warping and level of ruination depicted a place abandoned for much longer than a few years. But if someone had caught this strangeness earlier, any such observation had been stricken from the record. I am convinced now that I and the rest of the expedition were given access to these records for the simple reason that, for certain kinds of classified information, it did not matter what we knew or didn't know. There was only one logical conclusion. Experience told our superiors that few, if any of us, would be coming back. The deserted village had so sunk into the natural landscape of the coast that I did not see it until I was upon it. The trail dipped into a depression of sorts, and there lay the village, fringed by more stunted trees. Only a few roofs remained on the 12 or 13 houses, and a trail through had crumbled into porous rubble. Some outer walls still stood, dark rotting wood splotched with lichen, but for the most part these walls had fallen away and left me with a peculiar glimpse of the interiors. The remains of chairs and tables, a child's toys, rotted clothing, ceiling beams brought to earth, covered in moss and vines. There was a sharp smell of chemicals in that place, and more than one dead animal, decomposing into the mulch. Some of the houses had, over time, slid into the canal to the left, and looked in their skeletal remains like creatures struggling to leave the water. It all seemed like something that had happened a century ago, and what was left were just vague recollections of the event. But in what had been kitchens or living rooms or bedrooms, I also saw a few peculiar eruptions of moss or lichen, rising 4, 5 feet tall. Misshapen, the vegetative matter forming an approximation of limbs and heads and torsos, as if there had been runoff from the material, too heavy for gravity, that had congregated at the foot of these objects. Or perhaps I imagined this effect. Did I just skip a page? No. One particular tableau struck me in an almost emotional way. 4 such eruptions, one standing and 3 decomposed to the point of sitting, in what once must have been a living room with a coffee table and a couch, all facing some point at the far end of the room, where lay only the crumbling soft brick remains of a fireplace and chimney. The smell of lime and mint unexpectedly arose, cutting through the must, the loam. I did not want to speculate on that tableau, its meaning, or what element of the past it represented. No sense of peace emanated from that place, only a feeling of something left unresolved or still in progress. I wanted to move on, but first I took samples. I had a need to document what I had found, and a photograph didn't seem sufficient, given how the others had turned out. I cut a piece of the moss from the forehead of one of the eruptions. I took splinters of the wood. I even scraped the flesh of the dead animals, a stricken fox, curled up and dry, along with a kind of rat that must have died only a day or two before. It was just after I had left the village that a peculiar thing had happened. I was startled to see a sudden double line coming down the canal toward me, cutting through the water. My binoculars were no use as the water was opaque from the glare of the sun. Otters? Fish? Something else? I pulled out my gun. Then the dolphins breached, and it was almost as vivid a dislocation as that first descent into the tower. I knew that the dolphins here sometimes ventured in from the sea, had adapted to the fresh water. But when the mind expects a certain range of possibilities, any explanation that falls outside of that expectation can surprise. Then something more wrenching occurred. As they slid by, the nearest one rolled slightly to the side, and it stared at me with an eye that did not, in that brief flash, resemble a dolphin eye to me. It was painfully human, almost familiar. In an instant that glimpse was gone, and they had submerged again, and I had no way to verify what I had seen. I stood there, watched those twinned lines disappear up the canal, back toward the deserted village. I had the unsettling thought that the natural world around me had become a kind of camouflage. A little shaken, I continued toward the lighthouse, which now loomed larger, almost heavy, its black and white stripes topped with red, making it somehow authoritarian. I would have no further shelter before I reached my destination. I would stand out to whoever or whatever watched from that vantage as something unnatural in that landscape, something that was foreign, perhaps even a threat. There we go. Sorry about that. It was almost noon by the time I reached the lighthouse. I had been careful to drink water and have a snack on my journey, but I still arrived weary. Perhaps the lack of sleep had caught up with me. But then, too, the last 300 yards to reach the lighthouse were tension-filled, as I kept remembering the surveyor's warning. I had a gun out, held down by my side, for all the good it would do against a high-powered rifle. I kept looking at the little window halfway up its swirled black and white surface, and then to the large panoramic windows at the top, alert for any movement. The lighthouse was positioned just before a natural crest of the dunes that resembled a curled wave facing the ocean, the beach spread out beyond. Up close it gave the strong appearance of having been converted into a fortress, a fact conveniently left out of our training. This only confirmed the impression I had formed from farther out, because although the grass was still long, no trees at all grew along the trail from about a quarter mile out. I had found only old stumps. When within an eighth mile, what? When within an eighth mile, I had taken a look with my binoculars, and noticed an approximately 10-foot circular wall rising from the landward side of the lighthouse that had clearly not been part of the original construction. On the seaward side, another wall, an even stouter-looking fortification high on the crumbling dune, topped with broken glass, and, as I drew near, I could see crenellations that created lines of sight for rifles. It was all in danger of falling down the slope onto the beach below. But for it not to have done so already, whoever had built it must have dug its foundations deep. It appeared that some past defenders of the lighthouse had been at war with the sea. I did not like this wall because it provided evidence of a very specific kind of insanity. At some point, too, someone had taken the time and effort to rappel down the sides of the lighthouse and attach jagged shards of glass with some strong glue or other adhesive. These glass daggers started about one-third of the way up and continued to the penultimate level, just below the glass-enclosed beacon. At that point, a kind of metal collar extended out a good 2 or 3 feet, and this defensive element had been enhanced with rusty barbed wire. Someone had tried very hard to keep others out. I thought of the crawler and the words on the wall. I thought of the fixation with the lighthouse in the fragments of notes left by the last expedition. But despite these discordant elements, I was glad to reach the shadow of that cool, dank wall around the landward side of the lighthouse. From that angle, no one could shoot at me from the top, or the window in the middle. I had passed through the first gauntlet. If the psychologist was inside, she had decided against violence for now. The defensive wall on the landward side had reached a level of disrepair that reflected years of neglect. A large, irregular hole led to the lighthouse's front door. That door had exploded inward, and only fragments of wood clung to the rusted hinges. A purple flowering vine had colonized the lighthouse wall, and curled itself around the remains of the door on its left side. There was comfort in that, for whatever had happened with such violence must have occurred long ago. The darkness beyond, however, made me wary. I knew from the floor plan I had seen during training that this bottom level of the lighthouse had three outer rooms, with the stairs leading to the top somewhere to the left, and that to the right the rooms opened up into a back area with at least one more larger space. Plenty of places for someone to hide. I picked up a stone and half threw, half rolled it onto the floor, beyond those crushed double doors. It clacked and spun across tile, and disappeared from view. I heard no other sound, no movement, no suggestion of breathing beyond my own. Gun still drawn, I entered as quietly as I was able, sliding with my shoulder along the left-hand wall, searching for the entry point to the stairs leading upward. The outer rooms at the base of the lighthouse were empty. The sound of the wind was muffled, the walls thick, and only two small windows toward the front brought any light inside. I had to use my flashlight. As my eyes adjusted, the sense of devastation, of loneliness, grew and grew. The purple flowering vine ended just inside, unable to thrive in the darkness. There were no chairs. The tiles of the floor were covered in dirt and debris. No personal effects remained in those outer rooms. In the middle of a wide open space, I found the stairs. No one stood on those steps to watch me, but I had the impression someone could have been there a moment before. I thought about climbing to the top first, rather than exploring the back rooms, but then decided against it. Better to think like the surveyor, with her military training, and clear the area now, even though someone could always come in the front door while I was up there. The back room told a different story than the front rooms did. My imagination could only reconstruct what might have happened in the broadest, crudest terms. Here, stout oak tables had been overturned to form defensive barricades. Some of the tables were full of bullet holes, and others appeared half melted or shredded by gunfire. Beyond the remains of the tables, the dark splotches across the walls and pooled on the floor told of unspeakable and sudden violence. Dust had settled over everything, along with the cool, flat smell of slow decay, and I could see rat droppings, and signs of a cot or a bed having been placed in a corner at some later date. Although who could have slept among such reminders of a massacre? Someone, too, had carved their initials into one of the tables. R.S. was here. The marks looked fresher than the rest of it. Maybe you carved your initials when visiting a war monument, if you were insensitive. Here it stank of bravado to drown out fear. The stairs awaited, and to quell my rising nausea, I headed back to them and began to climb. I had put my gun away by then, since I needed that hand for balance, but I wished I had the surveyor's assault rifle. I would have felt safer. It was a strange ascent, in contrast to my descents into the tower. The brackish quality of the light against those graying interior walls was better than the phosphorescence of the tower, but what I found on these walls unnerved me just as much, if in a different way. More bloodstains, mostly thick smudges as if several people had bled out while trying to escape attackers from below. sometimes dribbles of blood, sometimes a spray. Words had been written on these walls, but nothing like the words in the tower. More initials, but also little obscure pictures and a few phrases of a more personal nature. Some longer hints of what might have transpired. 4 boxes of foodstuff, 3 boxes of medical supplies, and drinking water for 5 days if rationed. Enough bullets for all of us, if necessary. Confessions, too, which I won't document here, but that had the sincerity and weight of having been written immediately before or during moments when the individuals must have thought death was upon them. So many needing so much to communicate what amounted to so little. Things found on the stairs. A discarded shoe. A magazine from an automatic pistol. A few moldy vials of samples long rotted or turned to rancid liquid. A crucifix that looked like it had been dislodged from the wall. A clipboard, the wooden parts soggy and the metal parts deep orange red from rust. And, worst of all, a dilapidated toy rabbit with ragged ears. Perhaps a good luck symbol smuggled in on an expedition. There had been no children in Area X since the border had come down, as far as I knew. At roughly the halfway point, I came to a landing, which must have been where I had first seen the flicker of light the night before. The silence still dominated, and I had heard no hint of movement above me. The light was better because of the windows to left and right. Here the blood spatter abruptly cut off, although bullet holes riddled the walls. Bullet casings littered the floor, but someone had taken the time to sweep them off to the sides, leaving the path to the stairs above clear. To the left lay a stack of guns and rifles, some of them ancient, some of them not army issue. It was hard to tell if anyone had been at them recently. Thinking about what the surveyor had said, I wondered when I would encounter a blunderbuss or some other terrible joke. Otherwise, there was just the dust and the mold, and a tiny square window looking down on the beach and the reeds. Opposite it, a faded photograph in a broken frame, dangling from a nail. The smudged glass was cracked and half covered in specks of green mold. The black and white photograph showed 2 men standing at the base of the lighthouse, with a girl off to the side. A circle had been drawn with a marker around one of the men. He looked about 50 years old, and wore a fisherman's cap. A sharp eagle's eye gleamed out from a heavy face, the left eye lost to his squint. A thick beard hid all but a hint of a firm chin under it. He didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. I'd had experience enough with lighthouse keepers to know one when I saw one. But there was also some quality to him, perhaps just because of the strange way the dust framed his face, that made me think of him as the lighthouse keeper. Oh, I misread that sentence. I apologize. But there was also some quality to him, perhaps just because of the strange way the dust framed his face, that made me think of him as the lighthouse keeper. Or perhaps I'd already spent too much time in that place, and my mind was seeking any answer, even to simple questions. The rounded bulk of the lighthouse behind the 3 was bright and sharp, the door on the far right in good repair. Nothing like what I had encountered, and I wondered when the photo had been taken. How many years between the photograph and the start of it all? How many years had the lighthouse keeper kept to his schedule and his rituals, lived in that community, gone to the local bar or pub? Perhaps he'd had a wife. Perhaps the girl in the photo was his daughter. Perhaps he'd been a popular man. Or solitary. Or a little of both. Regardless, none of it had mattered in the end. I stared at him from across the years, trying to tell from the moldy photograph, from the line of his jaw and the reflection of light in his eyes, how he might have reacted, what his last hours might have been like. Perhaps he'd left in time, but probably not. Perhaps he was even mouldering on the ground floor in a forgotten corner. Or and I experienced a sudden shudder. Maybe he was waiting for me above, at the top, in some form. I took the photograph out of its frame, shoved it in my pocket. The lighthouse keeper would come with me, although he hardly counted as a good luck charm. As I left the landing, I had the peculiar thought that I was not the first to pocket the photo, that someone would always come behind to replace it, to circle the lighthouse keeper again. Happy holidays to you too, Optical Antenna. Thanks for tuning in. I continued to encounter additional signs of violence the higher I went, but no more bodies. The closer I came to the top, the more I began to have the sense that someone had lived here recently. The mustiness gave way to the scent of sweat, but also a smell like soap. The stairs had less debris on them, and the walls were clean. By the time I was bending over the last narrow stretch of steps out into the lantern room, the ceiling grown suddenly close, I was sure I would emerge to find someone staring at me. So I took out my gun again. But, again, no one was there. Just a few chairs, a rickety table with a rug beneath it, and the surprise that the thick glass here was still intact. The beacon glass itself lay dull and dormant in the center of the room. You could see for miles to all sides. I stood there for a moment, looking back the way I had come, at the trail that had brought me, at the shadow in the distance that might have been the village, and then to the right, across the last of the marsh, the transition to scrubland and the gnarled bushes punished by the wind off the sea. They, clinging to the soil, stopped it from eroding, and helped bulwark the dunes and the sea oats that came next. It was a gentle slope from there to the glittering beach, the surf, and the waves. It was a gentle slope from there to the glittering beach, the surf, and the waves. A second look, and from the direction of base camp, amid the swamp and far distant pines, I could see strands of black smoke, which could have meant anything. But I also could see, from the location of the tower, a kind of brightness of its own, a sort of refracted phosphorescence that did not bear thinking about. That I could see it, that I had an affinity to it, agitated me. I was certain no one else left here, not the surveyor, not the psychologist, could see that stirring of the inexplicable. I turned my attention to the chairs, the table, searching for whatever might give me insight into anything. After about 5 minutes, I thought to pull back the rug. A square trap door measuring about 4 feet per side lay hidden there. The latch was set into the wood of the floor. I pushed the table out of the way with a terrible rending sound that made me grit my teeth. Then, swiftly, in case someone waited down there, I threw open the trap door, shouting out something inane like, "I've got a gun!" and aiming my weapon with one hand and my flashlight with the other. I had the distant sense of the weight of my gun dropping to the floor, my flashlight shaking in my hand, though somehow I held on to it. I could not believe what I was staring down at, and I felt lost. The trap door opened onto a space about 15 feet deep and 30 feet wide. The psychologist had clearly been here, for her knapsack, several weapons, bottles of water, and a large flashlight lay off to the left side. But of the psychologist herself there was no sign. No, what had me gasping for breath, what felt like a punch in the stomach as I dropped to my knees, was the huge mound that dominated the space, a kind of insane midden. I was looking at a pile of papers with hundreds of journals on top of it, just like the ones we had been issued to record our observations of Area X, each with the job title written on the front, each, as it turned out, filled with writing. Many, many more than could possibly have been filed by only 12 expeditions. Can you really imagine what it was like in those first moments, peering down into that dark space and seeing that? Perhaps you can. Perhaps you're staring at it now. My third and best field assignment out of college required that I travel to a remote location on the western coast, to a curled hook of land at the farthest extremity from civilization, in an area that teetered between temperate and arctic climates. Here the earth had disgorged huge rock formations, and old-growth rainforest had sprouted up around them. This world was always moist, the annual rainfall more than 70 inches a year, and not seeing droplets of water on leaves was an extraordinary event. The air was so amazingly clean, and the vegetation so dense, so richly green, that every spiral of fern seemed designed to make me feel at peace with the world. Bears and panthers and elk lived in those forests, along with a multitude of bird species. The fish in the streams were mercury-free and enormous. I lived in a village of about 300 souls near the coast. I had rented a cottage next to a house at the top of a hill that had belonged to 5 generations of fisher-folk. A husband and wife, childless, owned the property, and they had the kind of severely laconic quality common to the area. I made no friends there, and I wasn't sure that even long-standing neighbors were friends either. Only in the local pub that everyone frequented, after a few pints, would you see signs of friendliness and camaraderie. But violence lived in the pub, too, and I kept away most of the time. I was 4 years away from meeting my future husband, and at the time I wasn't looking for much of anything from anyone. I had plenty to keep me busy. Every day I drove the hellish, winding road, rutted and treacherous even when dry, that led me to the place they called simply Rock Bay. There, sheets of magma that lay beyond the rough beaches had been worn smooth over millions of years and become pitted with tidal pools. At low tide in the morning, I would photograph those tidal pools, take measurements, and catalogue the life found within them, sometimes staying through part of high tide, wading in my rubber boots, the spray from the waves that smashed over the lip of the ledge, drenching me. A species of mussels found nowhere else lived in those tidal pools, in a symbiotic relationship with a fish called a gartner, after its discoverer. Several species of marine snails and sea anemones lurked there too. A tough little squid I nicknamed Saint Pugnacious, eschewing its scientific name, because the danger music of its white flashing luminescence made its mantle look like a pope's hat. I could easily lose hours there, observing the hidden life of tidal pools, and sometimes I marveled at the fact I had been given such a gift. Not just to lose myself in the present moment so utterly, but also to have such solitude, which was all I had ever craved during my studies, in my practice to reach this point. Even then, though, during the drives back, I was grieving the anticipated end of this happiness, because I knew it had to end eventually. The research grant was only for 2 years, and who really would care about mussels longer than that? And it's true my research methods could be eccentric. These were the kinds of thoughts I'd have as the expiration date came nearer, and the prospects looked dimmer and dimmer for renewal. Against my better judgment, I began to spend more and more time in the pub. I'd wake in the morning, my head fuzzy, sometimes with someone I knew but who was a stranger just leaving, and realize I was one day closer to the end of it all. Running through it, too, was a sense of relief, not as strong as the sadness, but the thought, counter to everything else I felt, that this way I would not become the person the locals saw out on the rocks, and still thought of as an outsider. Oh, that's just the old biologist. She's been here for ages, going crazy studying those mussels. She talks to herself, mutters to herself at the bar, and if you say a kind word. When I saw those hundreds of journals, I felt for a moment that I had become that old biologist after all. That's how the madness of the world tries to colonize you, from the outside in, forcing you to live in its reality. Reality encroaches in other ways, too. At some point during our relationship, my husband began to call me the ghost bird, which was his way of teasing me for not being present enough in his life. It would be said with a kind of creasing at the corner of his lips that almost formed a thin smile, but in his eyes I could see the reproach. If we went to bars with his friends, one of his favorite things to do. One of his favorite things. Let's try that again. I'm sorry. If we went to bars with his friends, one of his favorite things to do, I would volunteer only what a prisoner might during an interrogation. They weren't my friends, not really, but also I wasn't in the habit of engaging in small talk, nor in broad talk, as I like to call it. I didn't care about politics except in how politics impinged upon the environment. I wasn't religious. All of my hobbies were bound up in my work. I lived for the work, and I thrilled with the power of that focus, but it was also deeply personal. I didn't like to talk about my research. I didn't wear makeup or care about new shoes or the latest music. I'm sure my husband's friends found me taciturn, or worse. Perhaps they even found me unsophisticated, or strangely uneducated, as I heard one of them say, although I don't know if he was referring to me. I enjoyed the bars, but not for the same reasons as my husband. I loved the late night slow burn of being out, my mind turning over some problem, some piece of data, while able to appear sociable, but still existing apart. He worried too much about me, though, and my need for solitude ate into his enjoyment of talking to friends, who were mostly from the hospital. I would see him trail off in mid-sentence, gazing at me for some sign of my own contentment, as, off to the side, I drank my whiskey neat. "Ghostbird," he would say later, "did you have fun?" I'd nod and smile. But fun for me was sneaking off to peer into a tidal pool, to grasp the intricacies of the creatures that lived there. Sustenance for me was tied to ecosystem and habitat, orgasm the sudden realization of the interconnectivity of living things. Observation had always meant more to me than interaction. He knew all of this, I think, but I never could express myself that well to him, although I did try, and he did listen. And yet I was nothing but expression in other ways. My sole gift or talent, I believe now, was that places could impress themselves upon me, and I could become a part of them with ease. Even a bar was a type of ecosystem, if a crude one, and to someone entering, someone without my husband's agenda, that person could have seen me sitting there and had no trouble imagining that I was happy in my little bubble of silence, would have had no trouble believing I fit in. Yet even as my husband wanted me to be assimilated in a sense, the irony was that he wanted to stand out. Seeing that huge pile of journals, this was another thing I thought of, that he had been wrong for the 11th expedition because of this quality, that here were the indiscriminate accounts of so many souls, and that his account couldn't possibly stand out. That, in the end, he'd been reduced to a state that approximated my own. Those journals, flimsy gravestones, confronted me with my husband's death all over again. I dreaded finding his, dreaded knowing his true account, not the featureless, generic mutterings he had given to our superiors upon his return. "Ghostbird, do you love me?" he whispered once in the dark, before he left for his expedition training, even though he was the ghost. Ghost bird, do you need me? I loved him, but I didn't need him, and I thought that was the way it was supposed to be. A ghost bird might be a hawk in one place, a crow in another, depending on the context. The sparrow that shot up into the blue sky one morning might transform mid-flight into an osprey the next. This was the way of things here. There were no reasons so mighty that they could override the desire to be in accord with the tides and the passage of seasons and the rhythms underlying everything around me. That last paragraph is kind of an example of how Jeff Vandermeer is almost the opposite of CJ Cherry in that he uses a lot less punctuation. So it's not always easy for me to read the rhythm of the and cadence of the sentences, because otherwise they're very long run-on sentences. It works well if you're reading it in your head, but reading it aloud is actually kind of hard. Um, and I'm not like poetry minded enough to put in mental breaks where there should be ones. So that's on me. If some of these are getting mangled, I apologize. The journals and other materials formed a moldering pile about 12 feet high and 16 feet wide that in places. Let's try that sentence again. I think I just read the next line. The journals and other materials formed a moldering pile about 12 feet high and 16 feet wide that in places near the bottom had clearly turned to compost, the paper rotting away. Beetles and silverfish tended to those archives, and tiny black cockroaches with always moving antennae. Toward the base, the spilling out at the edges, I saw the remains of photographs and dozens of ruined cassette tapes. Excuse me. And dozens of ruined cassette tapes mixed in with the mulch of pages. There, too, I saw evidence of rats. I would have to lower myself down into the midden by means of the ladder nailed to the lip of the trap door, and trudge through a collapsing garbage hill of disintegrating pulp to uncover anything at all. The scene obliquely embodied the scrap of writing I had encountered on the tower wall. The seeds of the dead, to share with the worms that gather in the darkness and surround the world with the power of their lives. I overturned the table and laid it across the narrow entrance to the stairwell. I had no idea where the psychologist had gotten to, but I didn't want her or anyone else surprising me. If someone tried to move the table from below, I would hear it, and have time to climb up to greet them with my gun. I also had a sensation I can, in hindsight, attribute to the brightness growing within me, of a presence pressing up from below, impinging on the edges of my senses. A prickling crept across my skin at unexpected times, for no good reason. I didn't like that the psychologist had stashed all of her gear down with the journals, including what appeared to be most or all of her weapons. For the moment, though, I had to put the puzzle of that out of my mind, along with the still reverberating tremors from the certain knowledge that most of the training the Southern Reach had given us had been based on a lie. As I lowered myself into that cool, dark, sheltered space beneath, I felt the pull of the brightness within me even more acutely. That was harder to ignore, since I didn't know what it meant. My flashlight, along with the natural light from the open trap door, revealed that the walls of the room were rife with striations of mold, some of which formed dull stripes of red and green. From below, the way the midden spilled out in ripples and hillocks of paper became more apparent. Torn pages, crushed pages, journal covers warped and damp. Slowly, the history of exploring Area X could be said to be turning into Area X. I picked around the edges at first, chose journals at random. Most, at a glance, depicted quite ordinary events, such as those described by the first expedition, which could not have been the first expedition. Some were extraordinary only because the dates just did not make sense. How many expeditions had really come across the border? Just how much information had been doctored and suppressed, and for how long? Did 12 expeditions refer only to the latest iteration of a longer effort, the omission of the rest necessary to quell the doubts of those approached to be volunteers? What I would call pre-expedition accounts, documented in a variety of forms, also existed in that place. This was the underlying archive of audiocassettes, chewed-at photographs, and decomposing folders full of papers that I had first glimpsed from above. All of it oppressed by the weight of the journals on top. All of it suffused by a dull, damp smell that contained within it a masked, sharp stench of decay, which revealed itself in some places and not others. A bewildering confusion of typewritten, printed, and handwritten words piled up in my head alongside half-seen images like a mental facsimile of the midden itself. The clutter at times brought me close to becoming frozen, even without factoring in the contradictions. I became aware of the weight of the photograph in my pocket. I made some initial rules, as if that would help. I ignored journals that appeared to be written in a shorthand, and did not try to decipher those that appeared to be in code. I also started out reading some journals straight through and then decided to force myself to skim. But sampling was sometimes worse. I came across pages that described unspeakable acts that I still cannot bring myself to set down in words. Entries that mentioned periods of remission and cessation, followed by flare-ups and horrible manifestations. No matter how long Area X had existed, and how many expeditions had come here, I could tell from these accounts that for years before there had ever been a border, strange things had happened along this coast. There had been a Proto-Area X. Some types of omissions made my mind itch as much as more explicit offerings. One journal, half destroyed by the damp, focused solely on the qualities of a kind of thistle with a lavender blossom that grew in the hinterlands between forest and swamp. Page after page described encountering first one specimen of this thistle and then another, along with minute details about the insects and other creatures that occupied that microhabitat. In no instance did the observer stray more than a foot or two from a particular plant, and at no point either did the observer pull back to provide a glimpse of base camp or their own life. After a while, a kind of unease came over me as I began to perceive a terrible presence hovering in the background of these entries. I saw the crawler or some surrogate approaching in that space just beyond the thistle, and the single focus of the journal keeper a way of coping with that horror. An absence is not a presence, but still, with each new depiction of a thistle, a shiver worked deeper and deeper into my spine. When the latter part of the book dissolved into ruined ink and moist pulp, I was almost relieved to be rid of that unnerving repetition, for there had been a hypnotic, trance-like quality to the accounts. If there had been an endless number of pages, I feared that I would have stood there reading for an eternity, until I fell to the floor and died of thirst or starvation. I began to wonder if the absence of references to the tower fit this theory as well, this writing around the edges of things. In the black water, with the sun shining at midnight, those fruit shall come ripe. Then I found, after several banal or incomprehensible samples, a journal that wasn't the same type as my own. It dated back to before the first expedition, but after the border had come down, and referenced "building the wall," which clearly meant the fortification facing the sea. A page later, mixed in with esoteric meteorological readings, 3 words leapt out at me. Repelling an attack. I read the next few entries with care. The writer at first made no reference to the nature of the attack or the identity of the attackers, but the assault had come from the sea and left 4 of us dead, although the wall had held. Later, the sense of desperation grew, and I read. The desolation comes from the sea again, along with the strange lights and the marine life that at high tide batters itself against our wall. At night now, their outliers try to creep in through the gaps in our wall defenses. Still, we hold, but our ammunition is running out. Some of us want to abandon the lighthouse, try for either the island or inland, but the commander says she has her orders. Morale is low. Not everything that is happening to us has a rational explanation. Soon after, the account trailed off. It had a distinctly unreal quality to it, as if a fictionalized version of a real event. I tried to imagine what Area X might have looked like so long ago. I couldn't. The lighthouse had drawn expedition members like the ships it had once sought to bring to safety through the narrows and reefs offshore. I could only underscore my previous speculation that to most of them, a lighthouse was a symbol, a reassurance of the old order, and by its prominence on the horizon, it provided an illusion of safe refuge. That it had betrayed that trust was manifest in what I had found downstairs. And yet, even though some of them must have known that, still they had come. Out of hope, out of faith, out of stupidity. But I had begun to realize that you had to wage a guerrilla war against whatever force had come to inhabit Area X if you wanted to fight at all. You had to fade into the landscape, or, like the writer of the Thistle Chronicles, you had to pretend it wasn't there for as long as possible. To acknowledge it, to try to name it, might be a way of letting it in. For the same reason, I suppose, I have continued to refer to the changes in me as a brightness, because to examine this condition too closely, to quantify it or deal with it empirically when I have little control over it, would make it too real. At some point I began to panic at the sheer volume of what remained in front of me, and in my panic I refined my focus further. I would search only for phrases identical to or similar in tone to the words on the wall of the tower. I started to assail the hill of paper more directly, to wade into the middle sections, the rectangle of light above me a reassurance that this was not the sum of my existence. I rummaged like the rats and the silverfish. I shoved my arms into the mess and came out holding whatever my hands could grasp. At times I lost my balance and became buried in the papers, wrestled with them, my nostrils full of rot, my tongue tasting it. I would have looked unhinged to anyone watching from above, and I knew it even as I engaged in this frenzied, futile activity. But I found what I was looking for in more journals than I would have expected, and usually it was that beginning phrase. Where lies the strangling fruit that came from the hand of the sinner, I shall bring forth the seeds of the dead to share with the worms. Often it appeared as a scrawled margin note, or in other ways disconnected from the text around it. Once I discovered it documented as a phrase on the wall of the lighthouse itself, which we quickly washed away, with no reason given. Another time, in a spidery hand, I found a reference to text in a logbook that reads as if it came out of the Old Testament, but is from no psalm I remember. How could this not refer to the crawler's writing? To share with the worms that gather in the darkness and surround the world with the power of their lives. But none of this placed me any closer to understanding why or who. We were all in the dark, scrabbling at the pile of journals, and if ever I felt the weight of my predecessors, it was there and then, lost in it all. At a certain point, I discovered I was so overwhelmed that I could not continue, could not even go through the motions. It was too much data, served up in too anecdotal a form. I could search those pages for years, and perhaps never uncover the right secrets, while caught in a loop of wondering how long this place had existed, who had first left their journals here, why others had followed suit until it had become as inexorable as a long ingrained ritual. By what impulse, what shared fatalism? All I really thought I knew was that the journals from certain expeditions and certain individual expedition members were missing, that the record was incomplete. I was also aware that I would have to go back to base camp before nightfall, or remain at the lighthouse. I didn't like the idea of traveling in the dark, and if I didn't return, I had no guarantee the surveyor wouldn't abandon me and try to recross the border. For now, I decided on one last effort. With great difficulty, I climbed to the top of the midden, trying hard not to dislodge journals as I did so. It was a kind of roiling, moving monster beneath my boots, unwilling, like the sand of the dunes outside, to allow my tread without an equal and opposite reaction. But I made it up there anyway. As I'd imagined, the journals on the top of that mass were more recent, and I immediately found the ones written by members of my husband's expedition. With a kind of lurch in my stomach, I kept rummaging, knowing that it was inevitable what I would stumble upon, and I was right. Stuck to the back of another journal by dried blood or some other substance, I found it more easily than I'd imagined. My husband's journal, written in the confident, bold handwriting I knew from birthday cards, notes on the refrigerator, and shopping lists. The ghost bird had found his ghost on an inexplicable pile of other ghosts. But rather than looking forward to reading that account, I felt as if I were stealing a private diary that had been locked by his death. A stupid feeling, I know. All he'd ever wanted was for me to open up to him, and as a result he had always been there for the taking. Now, though, I would have to take him as I found him, and it would probably be forever, and I found the truth of that intolerable. I could not bring myself to read it yet, but fought the urge to throw my husband's journal back on the pile, and put it instead with the handful of other journals I planned to take back to base camp with me. I also retrieved two of the psychologist's guns as I climbed up out of that wretched space. I left her other supplies there for now. It might be useful to have a cache in the lighthouse. It was later than I had thought when I emerged from below, the sky taking on the deep amber hue that marked the beginning of the late afternoon. The sea was ablaze with light, but nothing beautiful here fooled me any more. Human lives had poured into this place over time, volunteered to become party to exile and worse. Why did they keep sending us? Why did we keep going? So many lies, so little ability to face the truth. Area X broke minds, I felt, even though it hadn't yet broken mine. A line from a song kept coming back to me. All this useless knowledge. After being in that space for so long, I needed fresh air and the feel of the wind. I dropped what I'd taken into a chair and opened the sliding door to walk out onto the circular ledge bounded by a railing. The wind tore at my clothes and slapped against my face. The sudden chill was cleansing, and the view even better. I could see forever from there. But after a moment, some instinct or premonition made me look straight down, past the remains of the defensive wall, to the breach, part of which was half hidden by the curve of the dune, the height of the wall, even from that angle. Emerging from that space was a foot and the end of a leg, amid a flurry of disrupted sand. I trained my binoculars on the foot. It lay unmoving. A familiar pant leg, a familiar boot, with the laces double tied and even. I gripped the railing tight to counter a feeling of vertigo. I knew the owner of that boot. It was the psychologist. And that will do it for today. Shorter one this week. Next week will also be short-ish, not terribly long, probably comparable length, maybe slightly longer. And then the week after that will be the last installment of Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, now a major motion picture. I don't actually know what streaming services carry it. If people care about that, I don't know off the top of my head. It's findable, I'm sure. Pretty good movie. Suitably spooky. Not exactly indicative or reflective of the book. It's very, very different. It's not bad. I enjoyed it, but if you're expecting the book, you're not getting it. I honestly don't think the book as written would be easy to make a workable Hollywood film, because movie-going audiences have certain expectations, and this would not live up to those. Or it would not reflect them anyway. At any rate, hope people are enjoying. I certainly enjoy reading it. Jeff Vandermeer is interesting. His writing prose is makes for an interesting change of pace. Normally, I don't do things terribly lyrical. So the too typical, you know. Yeah, I know. I know that sounds like I'm being like an elitist auteur or something, like, oh, well, if you're not doing something beyond expectation, can you really call it art? That defies expectation. Can you really call it art? And yeah, okay, maybe there's a bit of that. There's a bit of that. There's a bit of that elitism. I know what I like. You know who'd really do a killer rendition of these? Guillermo del Toro. He'd make them too human, though. I don't think he could do something that just makes people basically not humanized in some way. And that's kind of one of the recurring themes in this trilogy is people don't have their names. They have either what they do or some other appellation attached to them that they're referred to by. This kind of sort of changes in book 2, but even then it still basically remains true, because the main character, who has a name, and they even mention the name a couple times, is almost never referred to by that name. He's referred to as Control, which is a delightful multi-layered joke in the book, or in the series. It's like Ian M. Banks book title level, multi-level. Joke might be the wrong word, but multi-level play on words conceptually. It's pretty great. So yeah, with that, I'm gonna scooch. Hope people had a good holiday week. Mine was relatively busy, but still, it was nice. So I'll definitely keep doing this week in and week out. I am thinking of some scheduling changes. Mikey Rourke, yeah, Mikey Rourke. Actually, yeah, he could do a mean Annihilation. Probably. Anyway, with that, I'm going to, or Mickey Rourke, not Mikey Rourke. Don't mind me. I'm losing my mind. It's the end of a stream. My brain turns off. With that, and that's why I ramble so much. Beginning and end of the stream, I need to get my brain in gear, or disengage my brain from gear, and so I ramble. So yeah, the current plan going forward is my schedule will remain more or less as it is until I get through this book at least. I'm thinking of doing some scheduling changes. I'm thinking of just getting rid of Warframe Wednesdays and just replacing it with another reading stream, because I have so many I'd like to do. So many books. So many. But I'd have to figure out some witty some witty name for that, like Weeding Time Wednesdays, which sounds stupid, but it works. Because you'll notice mine are all pretty, there's alliteration. I need to come up with something alliterative, and I haven't thought of that yet, but we'll figure it out. Anyway, yeah, everyone take care. Stay safe, stay sane, be decent to each other, and don't let the crazy weather get you down, depending on where you are. I got off super light. Like I was expecting disaster, and it didn't happen. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to have to shovel 12 feet of snow. I'll take it. It's a win. I'm not going to have to worry about power outages for a week. Sweet. I'm down with that. I'm not going to have to worry about freezing temperatures that are going to freeze the entire apartment complex's heating system. Awesome. So none of that came to pass. So it was pretty quiet. So yeah, we'll be getting back to our normal schedule for at least the next 2 weeks. And then I'm thinking of doing some scheduling changes. I may start doing these on Saturday as well. Bring back Storytime Saturdays, but that's going to be kind of confusing. Oh, went to Disneyland. Nice. I can't imagine the number of people there. Is at Christmas time, holiday season time, particularly busy? Kind of imagine it must be. But still, so long as a good time was had. And this is the one out on the West Coast, I assume, based on my understanding of where you're located, which is pure guesswork at this stage. Das West Coast, since they do not refer to the one in Orlando as Disneyland so much as Disney World. I read a history on the construction of some of those places, and it is quite fascinating. You live through part of it as well, but oh, nice, nice, that's great. So long as everyone had fun, that's a good time. Drove from San Jose, nice. But did you know the way to San Jose? Wah, 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 wah. I got a million of them. I'll be here all night. I won't be here all night. I'll be asleep at night. Sorry. I have a sleep schedule. I try to keep to it. Alrighty, no, that's great. I'm glad people had a good time. Hopefully. I'm hoping people had a good time. You haven't actually given express confirmation that people did have a good time, so I'm making suppositions that maybe I shouldn't make. Anyway, I'm gonna go. I'm gonna leave you all to it. I'll try and keep people apprised with schedule changes as they occur. At the very least, I'll have it included in the stream description, and I'll figure it out. Star Wars rides were awesome. Cool. Very cool. I'm down with that. Alrighty, see you all later. Thanks for tuning in. If you're watching this after the fact, I do this live every Friday on Free Read Fridays, starting at about noonish Eastern Standard Time. When the schedule changes, I'll try and make it clear. So if you want to catch me live, you can do that. If you're watching it after the fact, cool. I'm not going to tell you anything silly like smash that like and subscribe button because why shill? Why shill? They're not going to pay me. Actually, if they start paying me, that's when the problems might start because some of this is copyrighted material and I'm going to have to figure out real quick how I deal with that. So there's that. Anyway, I'll keep people apprised on that too. Like I will find a way to keep people apprised and be like, hey, by the way, this is what happens. In case you ever had any interest, this is what goes on. Oh yeah, I'll start a blog. Yeah, I'll start blogging. I'll even get a webcam and show my face. That won't happen. Not happening. Oh, I could become a VTuber. Nope. Sorry. Not my style. Alrighty, see you all later.